Good evening, everyone. Welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC, is an inclusive and neutral platform for conversations, intellectual dialogues, exchange of ideas in the arts. Today's BIC Streams session is called Embroidery from Craft to Art, the craft heritage of the Mochis of Kutch, Gujarat. Embroidery is a traditional handicraft of India practiced by skilled artisans. Today, the finest embroidery pieces find a place of pride in museum collections. The book, The Shoemaker's Stitch, Mochi Embroideries of Gujarat in the Taki collection by Shilpa, Shah and Rosemary Crill showcases some examples of the Mochi community's craft. Apart from the communities that traditionally practiced embroidery, nowadays new skilled artisans have also entered the trade. In the session today, Rosemary Crill, author and former senior curator for South Asia at the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, and Asif Shaikh, textile expert and founder of CDS Art Foundation, will be in conversation with Radhi Parekh, the founder of Artisans. This will be followed by a question and answer session with the audience. The full bios of all the speakers will appear in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please drop them in the Q&A box also at the bottom of the screen. The speakers will address these questions at the end of the session. And now I hand it over to Radhi.
Thank you, Sneha. And thank you, Bangalore International Center, for inviting us. I'm deeply honored to be moderating today's discussion on something very close to my heart, understanding India's art, craft, and design in the context of those who make it. Both the breadth and the depth of such a study is represented in the book that Sneha introduced, The Shoemaker's Stitch, Mochi Embroideries of Gujarat in the Taki collection by Shilpa, Shah and Rosemary Crill. And as she said, the finest embroideries are represented in museum collections all over the world, and the Taki collection is no exception. Coming from a family of textile practitioners, it was Praful and Shilpa Shah who established the Taki collection of India in the 1970s in Surat. They named the collection as a tribute to the city that they live in, Surat, where the Tapi River flows through the city. The acronym Tapi also stands for the art and the people of India. So as the name suggests, it does not make a distinction between craft and art. And I just wanted to briefly say this, since the title of our discussion today refers to both craft evolving into art. I just wanted to clarify that in fact, the concept of kala in India encompasses art, craft, and design as one. And the shoemaker's stitch, as we will see, certainly epitomizes this. The book represents a collection that has great breadth. It has a range of historical embroidery from the 1700s that were made for the European markets, to costumes that were made for the royal family of Kutch from the 19th and early 20th centuries, to contemporary expressions. And the depth of the study includes, in the appendices of the book, these wonderful three chapters on the genealogy of the Mochi families who practice the art. And it credits, very importantly, professional women embroiderers from the families with their names for the first time. So it's this evolution of the art form that I would like to focus on today. And particularly since we have Rosemary Crill and Asif Shaikh, who is a contemporary practitioner here with us, it would be wonderful to begin with an introduction to Mochi embroidery. And Rosemary will also share images of some of the Tapi collection to illustrate the evolution that we'll be discussing. But to begin with, Rosemary, I'd like to ask you a very fundamental question. Who are the Mochis, and what is it that is significant about Mochi embroidery, especially since chain stitch is very widely practiced in both forms, with the needle as well as the awl? Why did this particular form of embroidery deserve to be written about?
Thanks, Radhi. Yeah, well, all of those are great questions. First, I should say that, well, I think most things deserve to be written about. There's very little that isn't really worth further investigation, especially when you're talking about India's textile crafts. There's so much to delve into. So this is really just one small area out of many that we've chosen to do this particular book on. The Mochis were originally, they came from Sindh, although their history is lost in the mists of time. All the Mochis themselves seem to agree that originally their homeland was in Sindh. And they started off there, they moved to Gujarat, where they continued the craft, or indeed art, of embroidering on leather, for which they had already been very well known in Sindh, even as early as the 12th century, when Marco Polo even commented on the wonderful leather work that was to be found in Sindh. So they started off not as embroiderers on cloth, but on leather. Not treating the leather, they weren't chamars, they were using already processed leather and just beautifying it. So really they started off using that. That's why we call the book The Shoemaker's Stitch, because they started off really working with shoes and leather mats and other leather goods and embroidering patterns onto that with the very stout hooked needle called the ari, which, as Asif will show us later, is still used today for the much finer embroidery. As to why the mochi work is so special, you just have to look at any of the pieces that survive, or the illustrations in the book, to see how incredibly fine, how beautiful, how extremely skilled these artisans were to have made these pieces. So I think just that on the basis of their beauty alone, they're worth illustrating in a book. But I hope that we've also shown a lot more about their history and how the craft developed over the centuries.
Yes, and that's what's so wonderful about the Tapi collection and the spectrum that it represents. My second question is about the Tapi collection. You've worked with many masterpieces of Ari embroidery at the V&A that you've curated and written about. What makes the Tapi collection so unique?
Well, the mochi work, specifically in the Tapi collection, and of course this is just a tiny part of that huge collection. Mm-hmm. So if we're just talking about the mochi work, Praful and Shilpa did a wonderful job of putting together a really sizable group of pieces, which form a body of evidence, if you like, for the evolution of the work. So from some early trade pieces right up to contemporary 20th century pieces. So they have really made a very significant corpus of material that just fits really well into one volume.
Mm-hmm. The earliest Tapi collection embroideries are from the 1700s with strong Mughal and European influences. And I've always been really curious about how these hybrid designs emerged, and how were the European orders placed? What were the sorts of visual references that the embroiderers were sent? It would be fascinating to see that what were the influences and what was a little bit about the market that they were making it for from the 1700s to the late 1800s.
Well, we're talking about two main streams here, that early period. First, as you say, things like the Mughal court, and you get the very typical floor spreads, furnishings done in that wonderful floral Mughal style that we know from block prints and other kinds of decoration at the Mughal period, in the Mughal period. But the things made for the European market has a much more complicated background, because in the 17th century, in the 1600s, when the East India Company and so on were formed in both Britain and in Holland, they started trading with India, obviously, very early on in the 1600s. And so things were moving backwards and forwards and amassing all these different influences that were all mixed up together. So if you look at one of the, I'll show a picture later on, if you look at an embroidery made for the Western market, you can see that it's got some elements of British 17th century embroidery in it, which itself was already mixed up, had influences from Netherlandish tapestries and all sorts of things, even Chinese elements. So those incorporated some Indian elements, exotic birds, the colors, the beautiful indigo and lac and madder that were used for the reds. So the color palette also is very much an Indian input into that very mixed aesthetic. So as to how those orders were placed, we don't really have an awful lot of evidence, except we do have the letters that went back and forth extremely slowly, of course, because they were coming by ship. So it took many months for an instruction to come from England to India. But the East India Company would receive a shipment of textiles and they'd write back and say, we like this, we don't like this, you know, we don't like, we want more branched flowers and this kind of thing. And this also applied, of course, very much to the chintz textiles that were being made on the Coromandel coast in southeast India. And sometimes we get parallel designs being made both in chintz in southeast India and in embroidery in northwest India. So how that extraordinarily complex organization was really carried out, we can only surmise. And we do suspect that some actual pieces of English textile may have been sent out to India for the Indian embroiderers to, if not copy, then adapt and do their own versions of. So it was quite an extremely complicated system, all having to be carried out at this extremely slow pace, because of course there was, you know, no fast way of communicating in those days.
And an example of great international exchange.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The early days have also included Jacobean pieces.
Yes, absolutely.
India.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of that, you know, that sort of crewel work that was being done in under King James in England, the Jacobean period. That's very much part of what fed into the Indian trade pieces.
Right. Fascinating. Fascinating. And to contrast this with the 19th and 20th century pieces that were made for the royal family of Kutch, who were great patrons of this art. The Taki collection has a remarkable personal trousseau of Rani Gangaba, the wife of the Maharao Khemji III of Kutch. And you know, I would love for you at this point to talk a little bit about their work, perhaps showing us the evolution through images that
sure.
we're really
Yes. Why don't
seeing. Yes.
I will share my screen and we'll go on to my pictures. First slide. So the cover of the book, as you've already seen, I just wanted to draw attention to this extraordinary image that is on the front cover, which looks as if it might be just a sort of made up image to make a dramatic cover, but it is in fact a close-up detail of one of the pieces we'll be seeing later on. It's a horse cover, which is part of that collection that came from Gangaba, the Maharani of Kutch. So just looking back a little into the history of the Mochis, as I mentioned, they were firstly leather workers, and decorating shoes, making shoes was a large part of their trade, but this soon was transferred onto embroidering on cloth, although they were using the same chain stitch which was produced by this hooked ari. And in this lovely 19th century picture, which is now in the British Library, you can see very, very usefully and interestingly one of the Mochi community working on leather on the right, and on the left his colleague is stitching a beautiful, probably a gagra skirt on the left. So as I mentioned, leather work was their original skill, and this piece in the V&A actually is from Sindh. It's not from Kutch. It's one of the sort of original, from their original homeland of Sindh, where they embroidered these leather sleeping mats. And I don't know if you can see on the detail, but they're done in still done in a very, very fine chain stitch embroidery on silk. So this is the kind of thing that the Mochis started off really concentrating on. We mentioned things made for the Mughal court and for other very prestigious patrons like noblemen and so on. And this floor spread is very typical of that Mughal style. It probably dates to about 1700. And you can see it's using that very typical Mughal floral motif with the individual flowers standing in rows around the central field with its medallion and corner pieces, almost like a bookbinding. And this is something, of course, that was very, very widespread across large rectangular textiles at the Mughal court. So this would have been spread on the floor, and the ruler would have sat on it. Pieces for export became a very important part of what the Gujarati embroiderers were producing. And this wonderful piece, this is actually in the V&A rather than the Taki collection. This is one of the earlier known surviving pieces from the 17th century made for export. In this case, this is part of a group that came from a very well-known house called Ashburnham Place in Sussex. And the whole group is sometimes named after that house, called the Ashburnham type of embroidery. And so you can see that it's a wonderful kind of hybrid mixture of designs with some elements taken from Western Jacobean embroidery, but you also get these very exotic birds. And of course, the deep colors are something that could never be achieved except by Indian dyers. If you look at the detail on the right, you can see the depth of that indigo blue is absolutely amazing. They must have had to dip that silk thread a lot of times to get that extraordinary color. And the brilliant pink is probably a mixture of lac and madder dye. Again, dyes that were just not available to non-Indian dyers who wouldn't have had really the technical skill to achieve that kind of depth of color. And of course, one of the things that won the European markets over was the fact that these colors were fast. They didn't disappear when you washed it. The only exception to that is yellow, which is not a fast dye. So the extraordinary thing about this group of textiles, this particular set, the Ashburnham set, is that the yellows are all still intact. They haven't faded or washed out. This splendid hanging in the Taki collection, which is in the book, this type is called a Palampur, which is a sort of anglicized term from Palampur, Persian term meaning bed cover. So it could be used either as a bed cover or on the wall, as they increasingly were. The first popular sort of category of export textiles to reach Europe were really bed furnishings. So bed hangings, bed covers, all the hangings that went around a bed. And these sort of migrated onto the wall. And this very spectacular hanging is very large. The design is based, obviously tailored to Dutch taste, because these bouquets of flowers in vases, like you can see in the detail on the right, are copied very faithfully from prints of the same subjects. And of course, they also draw on the famous Dutch flower paintings. The colors, however, are something that the Indian craftsmen would have dreamed up themselves. So you get these wonderful, quite crazy sort of color combinations sometimes. And this rather deep green and quite densely packed pattern would particularly appeal to the Dutch market. So these are the sort of things that were in the export category, but the majority of the pieces in the book are this much more familiar type of mochi embroidery made for local patrons in Kutch. So these would have been made really for quite wealthy patrons. This wasn't a folk embroidery, it's not domestic embroidery, which are made mostly by women in their own homes. These are made by professional embroiderers who are mostly men, but not exclusively, as we've shown in the book. And they would have been very expensive. The silk yarn and the silk fabric, which would probably be imported from China, not to mention the labor and skill involved, would have resulted in a very expensive item. So it's not surprising that their main patrons were the royal ladies of Kutch. And this is a detail, a hem, a border detail of a skirt, a gagra. This one, in fact, that's in the collection, in the book, and is part of that great collection that came to the Taki collection directly from the descendants of Maharani Gangaba, who was the wife of the Maharao of Kutch, Kengarji III. And as Radhi mentioned, he ruled from 1876 to 1942. So pieces like this probably date to maybe around 1900 or the late 19th century. And you can see how beautifully embroidered they are. We're also very lucky to have some archival photographs. And here is Maharani Gangaba herself in a studio photograph. So she's wearing an embroidered skirt and short-sleeved blouse with a large orni or shawl over the top. So the skirt she's wearing in this photograph is not quite as densely embroidered as the one I just showed. It's perhaps more like the piece that we see on the left, with slightly more scattered sprigs of flowers. Another wonderful archival photograph shows this person. She's probably not a royal lady because her shawl is quite simple, quite plain, but she is wearing the most gorgeous embroidered, mochi embroidered skirt. And again, you can see that those motifs are large and quite spaced out, very much like the design of the wonderful purple skirt on the left. So this embroidery, as I mentioned, is done by professionals. And in order to make sure that their work was the most accurate, the most precise, the best thought out, it was all drawn beforehand. So the designer would draw out the different booties, the flowers, and the border patterns, as you see in the lower half of this page on the right, which would then be handed to the embroiderer. And so he or she would follow this meticulously to make sure that the best quality, the crispest and most accurate embroidery would be followed. As well as these wonderful skirts, of course, they're paired with blouses like these. This is a very beautiful embroidered choli or kanchli. You'll notice that it's embroidered all over and that both its sleeves have the same design. This was something that supposedly only royal ladies could wear. If you recall from those photographs, the shawl with which these outfits were worn covered the right shoulder and only the left arm and sleeve would be visible. So the finest embroidery would often be on the left sleeve. In this piece, for example, you can see that the left sleeve is done in Gujarati brocaded silk and metal wrapped thread, whereas the right hand sleeve is embroidered in Ari work. So although the book covers a lot of these wonderful garments, the Mochi embroiderers also were very well known for doing furnishing fabrics, interior furnishings, as well as dress. And this is a view of the interior of the Aina Mahal in Bhuj. And you can see that all around the base of the wall are these amazing embroidered panels forming a sort of dado. The Aina Mahal was built in about 1750. And it shows an extraordinary sort of hybrid taste with a lot of Western influence. And this is partly due to the work of somebody called Ram Singh Malam, who was a Gujarati, not a Kutchi. He came from Dwarka. And he'd been a sailor from a very young age who was shipwrecked off South Africa and was rescued, or indeed captured, by a Dutch vessel who took him back to Holland. And he spent 17 years in Holland, where he studied architecture, tile making, enamel work, and all sorts of other crafts. And when he eventually returned to India in the middle of the 18th century, the Maharao of the time, Lakpatji, employed him to work on the Aina Mahal, especially on the mirrors that give the building its name. Aina means mirror. Now, we don't know if he had anything to do with the design of these embroideries. They're portable. They could have been there at the original building of the Aina Mahal in the 1750s. They could be a little later, but their designs are something that certainly could date from the 18th century, as they're a sort of hybrid of Mughal and Western imagery. Here's another view of the Aina Mahal showing more of the embroideries. And these glass-clad pillars were something that we know that Ram Singh Malam particularly created for the Aina Mahal. And in fact, he set up a glass factory in Mandvi for the manufacture of that glass. So although he's not a Mochi, and we don't know if he was involved in the creation of these embroideries, he's definitely a big part of the flowering of the decorative arts in 18th century Bhuj. And we know that the fantastic panels that decorate the Aina Mahal were made especially for that building, because a lot of them are made exactly to fit in certain spaces. These, for example, go under the raised threshold step leading into one of the chambers. So the lower part has been very carefully designed to fit a smaller but a related pattern into the sequence. Although we don't know the date of the Aina Mahal embroideries precisely, we do know the date of this amazing tent, which survives with the royal family of Drangadra in Gujarat. And it has an embroidered inscription giving the date of 1856. So it's about 100 years later than the Aina Mahal, but you can see that the extraordinary exuberance of the embroidery hasn't diminished in that time. This tent wasn't made for weddings. There's a tradition in that royal family that weddings don't take place under a canopied tent or a hanging, but it was used for significant gatherings, for when important visitors came, or when there was a very significant puja, for example, to alleviate drought. So Drangadra is not in Kutch itself, but it had very close ties by marriage with the Kutch rulers, and a lot of the Drangadra princesses intermarried with Kutch, and they certainly would have had access to the Kutch court embroiderers. Religious hangings were also commissioned from the Mochis. These are two pitchwais made for Krishna temples or for the private homes of devotees. The one on the left is the right-hand side of a larger hanging that would have been on both sides of a doorway. You can see here the gopis, Krishna's companions, and the tree, the Kadamba tree in the center, symbolizes Krishna, as does the peacock perched on its top, but he himself is not shown in this particular one. On the right, we have Krishna Srinathji in the middle, and he's surrounded by cows, and this celebrates the festival of Gopashtami, which celebrates his coming of age as a cowherd. Smaller religious pieces are like this Gomukhi, or cow's mouth, which are used to hold prayer beads. And in another wonderful archival photograph, you can see this Vaishnavite priest using a very similar piece, and he's holding his beads inside the bag. Not only Hindu religious objects were made by the Mochis. This is a Jain book cover, embroidered with the auspicious emblems of Jainism. And there are several of these illustrated in the book. Quite an extraordinary development, if you like, of Mochi embroidery, and which really, I think, shows how fine the stitching can be and what you can achieve with extraordinary use of color and shading. This portrait of Gandhiji on the left, not in the Tapi collection, it belongs to Shrujan now in Bhuj. It was made probably for an exhibition, and we know who made it. It was made by an embroiderer called Hansraj Bai Bharatwala, Bharatwala meaning embroiderer. And for it, he won a gold medal at an exhibition in Mysore in 1933. The piece on the right, in considerably, sadly deteriorated condition now, but it's a lot older, it dates to about 1860. And you may recognize the subject. It's Krishna Raja Wadiyar of Mysore. And again, it probably was made for an exhibition in Mysore. One of the most extraordinary pieces in the collection is this fabulous horse cover, covered all over with embroidered imagery, foliage, animals, flowers. Obviously, this wouldn't have been used on an everyday basis, and this also comes from Gangabar's collection. And it's also interesting that, like the floral pieces, this kind of very extravagant and complicated vegetation would also have been worked out on paper beforehand. And you can see the monkey and the elephant, and perhaps you can just make out the blue monkey in the detail on the left. So these things were not done freehand. They were all worked out on paper beforehand in order to make sure that everything was done to the highest standard and fitted into the space provided. Some of the Mochi embroiderers also diversified into metalwork. I mentioned that they'd worked earlier on leather, and this included working with the incredibly dense and thick rhinoceros hide, like the shield on the left. Although it's leather, it's impossible to embroider because it's so thick. So you have to treat it almost like stone or metal, and it's actually carved with a special carving tool. So it didn't take very much to make the leap into metalwork. And you can see that the same sort of scrolling vegetation that we saw on the embroidery is also translated into these amazing metal vessels, which were also made by members of the Mochi community. And they also started to work in enamel work, something that was introduced by Ram Singh Malam, who I mentioned earlier, like the central boss in this fabulous shield, which is in a private collection in England. Moving on to the modern period, I should just say a word about something that came up at the end of the last century. From about the 1990s, a lot of apparently Mughal period Mochi embroideries started to appear on the market, and some started to be bought by museums. The piece on the left is in the National Gallery of Australia. The piece on the right is in the Taki collection. But so many of these started to appear in international auctions and so on, that some of us started to get a bit suspicious about them, and the colors also seemed to us not quite right. And so Stephen Cohen in 2001, after he'd amassed many examples of these pieces that had come onto the market, wrote an article alerting people to the fact that they were not, in fact, 18th or 18th century pieces. They were modern fakes, if you like, made by a very skilled craftsman in Jaipur, and being sold internationally as much older pieces. So although these had entered several museum collections, including the Taki collection, we can now really spot these modern pieces, partly because of this sort of dark green and rather brick red that they tend to use, and also a rather brilliant pink. Also, the ground material is a little bit too uniform, although it's hand woven, hand spun and hand woven. It doesn't look like 18th century cloth. So if ever you're offered one of these, watch out. This is another very beautiful, but again, modern piece done by Gulshan in Jaipur in about 1996, which is now in the Taki collection and is in the book. And you can see, if you think back to that Mughal floor spread I showed earlier, it's sort of based on that kind of thing, and mixed with a bit of European imagery in the vases in the corners, but it's got this dark green, a sort of brilliant pink, as well as that rather bricky red. And the whole piece is rather cramped in its design and not as elegantly done as we would expect had it been genuine. So that's a cautionary tale. Some other contemporary pieces are much more different, if you like, totally moved away from the traditional styles of Mochi embroidery. These two pieces, purely decorative hangings, are by embroiderers called Kasambai and Jumabai Sangar, and they're the sons of a celebrated embroiderer called Adam Sangar, whose work is in some collections, and these are actually versions of some of their father's earlier pieces. So totally different sort of narrative forms. And just to finish up, we have work by our friend Asif Shaikh, including this gorgeous rendition of the Jali in Sidi Said mosque in Ahmedabad, which he has rendered in chain stitch in, I think, 2015. And Asif is doing all sorts of fantastically interesting and beautiful things, but using chain stitch as a basis. Like, for example, this beautiful work of about 2019 from a series that he did of birds. But I think that's a good place to stop and hand back to Radhi.
Thank you, Rosemary, for that fascinating sweep through history. And thank you especially for, telling us about some of that social history, which sometimes you don't get when you're just appreciating the art form. Really, really fascinating. Asif, this brings us the last slide to you. As we know now from Rosemary's presentation, Mochi embroidery was very much done professionally. It was the livelihood of the Mochi community, and it was made to commission. And in that sense, Asif, you continue that wonderful artistic and professional practice. You also started your studio with Ari Embroidery in 2002. And I was just wondering, I read a little bit about you embroidering from the time that you were a child. And I wonder whether you can tell us a little bit about what drew you to Ari embroidery in particular, and how you learned that art.
So thank you, Rosemary, for a wonderful presentation, and thank you, Radhi, for introduction. I started in very early age as a hobby because I was physically very weak child, so I could not play with other children So I don't know how and why I started this, but I used to work on hoop with all these Gujarati embroideries, Sadhu Bharat, and different kinds of mirror tying and all that. I had never learned from anyone. I started using frame and cotton thread needle, and whatever I see in picture or actual embroidery, I used to try by myself. And that's how I have innovated so many new stitches. When I joined School of Architecture for my interior design, I realized I'm doing this technical course, but before that I became an artist. I got a master of pencil at the age of 18. And so my drawing was really good. I used to draw flora and fauna, butterflies and birds, which you can see in my work even after 3 decades. So I started thinking of doing something with embroidery as well with my interior knowledge. And but the embroidery which I used to do was on hoop, which is not possible for the commercial production. And so I strongly finalized that no, I want to work in the embroidery sector. So I started going to embroidery workshop in Old City in Ahmedabad. And once I remember as a very young child, I went to some embroidery studio with my mother. And I saw this scroll frame. And I saw that I cannot see thread on the top. Needle is going past through the fabric and suddenly thread is coming out. So that was a curiosity. And so I thought I should learn this technique. So I used to spend whole day in workshops in Old City, like a school. And I used to draw there and started learning this technique. So I started learning Ari and Zardozi. These are the two techniques which we practice on scroll frame, which in India we call it karcho. And in a very bad language, we call it khatla bharat. Okay, which is a charpai, which is a wrong word, but karcho. And whatever you do on karchob is a karchobi. And two main technique. One is a chain stitch, where we use this needle, which is made with umbrella wire, and cotton thread we roll on that wire, so it gets very good grip. So that was my curiosity, that needle was passing through the fabric and it was coming out. So I sat with them and I tried, and my needle didn't come out. So then I learned that while pulling the needle from the fabric with the thread on it, you have to twist the needle. So when you twist the needle, then only it will come out with the thread. Otherwise, it will stuck with the warp or weft. So that's what I learned as a child. But then in my 20s, I started learning this technique and started my studio first time in 1992. My label started, Asif label started in 2002, but I started my journey as a professional. I opened my first store called Darpan, and that's where I started 30 years back. Exact date is 22nd November 1992. So this 22nd, I will complete 3 decades. But in 1997 or 8, first time in 98, that was my first visit to Kutch. And I saw this Ari embroidery in Kutch, and it was totally different than what we practice on karcho, on scroll frame. Thread was different, so it is silken floss they don't use twisted yarn. So whatever embroidery we have seen in Rosemary's presentation, most of the embroidery is done by with the silken floss, not with the twisted yarn. So we were talking about the fake, old textile people sell now. So first thing we check with the thread, and we can make out, after so many years experience, that this is not old piece and the fake piece. We have seen that wonderful image, Rosemary, of 18th century. The man is doing embroidery. The Mochi is doing Ari embroidery, and without any frame. So in India, we have never used any kind of frame for our embroidery. When European entered in this country, they brought a hoop. And when Persian and Muslim entered in this country, they brought a scroll frame. And we started using those and for the karkhanas. But this Ari embroidery, Mochi community had never used hoop or scroll frame. They used to stitch the lenga or ghagra first, and after stitching, after joining their side, not the pleating, but the side. So they make their fabric round, in circular form. And then they used to hold those fabric between two knee, under the knee. They put their fabric and then they spread their leg. So the fabric stretch. One hand go under the fabric and on top. And like in our embroidery, we use this very tiny hook. But in Ari Bharat, in Mochi work, they use very thick needle like a crochet. Okay, and on top of that, they have one wooden, handle, which they hold like this. And they use this way. Their hand works like this. Like our hand work like this. Very different. So that same technique, even I have seen in Uzbekistan, same technique they use. Their needles are always on angle. On 45 to 60 degree angle, they hold the needle. Like we hold on 90 degree. So it is always straight. So that's the reason in Ari embroidery on scroll frame, it's very fine. I can show you one or two sample in between. So this is very fine Ari embroidery. So here I have used twisted yarn and this needle. So I got fascinated with Ari Bharat of Kutch when I saw this old textile in museum in Aina Mahal and with some antique dealer. And I came back, I did my drawings. I started, as we have seen in Rosemary's presentation, everything was drawn on the paper. So even I draw my design on butter paper. Then nowadays we convert and transfer into computer and make this printout. Then put a butter paper, the garware, which is a polyester sheet, and we put it on this paper and we do perforation with a very fine needle and make a hole. And we transfer. In olden days, they used to draw on paper and then they used to use carbon paper and used to transfer their design. Now we use a stencil and a white chalk with kerosene in India. On white cloth, we use needle. Or in general market, in regular workshops, they burn the newspaper. So in newspaper ash, you have the ink. So they use those burn newspaper powder for their printing, not in the needle, not indigo. But in our studio, in Asif studio, we don't use any kind of chemical. So we use white chalk, not zinc oxide. So in general market, people use zinc oxide, which we don't use. So like in olden days, in Rosemary's presentation, we have seen the, motifs are very sharp. The color palette is so beautiful. Where in today's time, we hardly get pure silk and natural, fiber for embroidery. But these are the yarn which are available in the market, which are chemically dyed, not natural dyed. But in my studio, we by yarn, which people use for weaving. So it is less than half thickness of embroidery yarn. I go to Kutch and dye my yarn with natural dyes and use for my embroidery. So that's how we practice. But it is not viable for the market. When you have passion, when you don't see the price range and anything, then only you can do it. But I came back from Kutch and I have redesigned those motifs, because when I started doing the copy of Kutchi motifs and the work with Ari embroidery on scroll frame, it was looking so bad. So I had to convert those motifs into Ari embroidery, which is on Karcho, fine Ari embroidery. So when I converted, so I got inspiration from this original design, and I have converted those motifs with my embroidery. So roughly 25 to 30%, I had to change the design and the shape of the motif. And then I did it my first sample in 1998. And it was looking so nice. And I have done a big production using those designs. And that's how Kutchi design or Kutchi collection started on the scroll frame. So now in 21st century, nobody wants to use those old color palette, which you can find in old V&A museum collection. So most of the folk artists, they have used the black outline so their motif can pop up. So instead of that, I have changed the palette and started doing same design, same. Now this is the old one and this is the new one. Now for today's time, we need little glitter. So I have added metal strips, badla, with Zardozi technique, glass beads, and sequins with my embroidery. So it started looking very nice, festive. But my palette was like a European palette. This was my palette. And these are the work which we used to export, right? For European market, we were using this. But the Kutchi palette was this. Now, one of my client gave me this red color and she said, Kush red. And I said, oh, I don't know what this Kush red means. You send me your fabric and I got this red color. And I could not imagine that I can work on this red color. And it took like 1 month to convince myself I can work on this. And I have used this color palette. And I told her, whatever I will make, you have to buy. Okay, this is customized, so I will not take this. She said, go ahead and do it. So this is the first sari I did using Kutchi design for my embroidery. And even today, after about 25 years, this design is a hot favorite in my studio. Later on, this is the first sample which I saw in Kutch. Where we have, this is the design which you have even seen in Rosemary's drawing. One of the slide has this drawing. It has 14 different colors in one palette, in one design. So this is the first sample, but what I saw in Kutch, I don't know why they have cut this border into two. So I saw these two sample together. And from there, I have redesigned and made this. After that, I have done same design with miniature. So that's the actual size, and this is a 25% of that design. So I have miniaturized my, designs of Kutch, which is so fine. You can just compare these two samples together. So this is how you can create the finest chain stitch on Karcho. And this is my recent work. And this is also there, I think, in the B&A Museum on black color. There are cut pieces, not one big lenga or sari. But this is how I make my work using these motifs and practicing using natural fibers and natural fabric only we use, and different kinds of natural fiber with natural dyes. We practice in my studio and create my Kutch collection. I call it Kutch collection. I don't call it Mochi work or Mochi, because Mochi community have done Ari Bharat. So I don't use Mochi work, but I definitely use my Kutch collection, which I really enjoy. Even today, doing Kutch is my most favorite. So this is, and then I redesign, I then make my own border. I take inspiration from old Kutch and then make my motifs from there. So this is an old inspiration from old collection. Then I have redesigned my motif with a paisley. So I got inspired with the, sirpage, kalgi, and that's how I. So when I met Rosemary in 2008 in V&A Museum, she has shared a so beautiful collection from their archive. And I thought I should work more on this. And that was one of the reasons that I have continued my Kutch embroidery.
Wonderful. It's so wonderful, Asif, to see this embroidery, being practiced at such a high level of finesse, both in color and technique and material. Thank you so much for sharing all those examples. Thank you. We've sadly come to almost the very end of our time together on this session. And I wanted to end with a final question. Of course, Asif, you represent hope for the future. But as we know, the hereditary art of the Mochis is now extinct. And like it, so many other beautiful embroidery traditions that are practiced by other Kutchi communities like the Kanbi, the Meghwal, Ahirs, Rabaris, and the Gujars. And I find that they are particularly not embroidering so much for themselves and their homes as they used to, as women get more educated, work outside the home, and all of this. So I wanted to ask you both a question. What is your hope for the future of our art and craft, particularly to do with embroidery, perhaps with reference to conservation and documentation, as well as practice? Rosemary, I'd like to ask you that question first.
Right, well, maybe I should start off talking about from a slightly more preservation point of view. There are some collections, including, of course, the Taki collection, but also obviously places like the Calico Museum in Ahmedabad, the National Museum, the Handicrafts Museum in Delhi, CSMVS in Mumbai. Many places are doing a fantastic job of documenting, preserving, showing, exhibiting historic textiles as well as contemporary work. So I think in the museum world, good work is going on, and also textile conservation is slowly starting to become a recognized technical important skill in India. It's not just about the rafugars anymore, but people who are properly trained in the preservation of historic textiles are now also starting to do very, very important and useful work. So I think from the historic point of view, there's a lot of very good preservation work going on, but I think I might leave it to you and Asif to talk about the contemporary side of things.
Asif, what do you think? Of course, your work represents hope and you work on this fine luxury level of the art. And I'm so glad that, you know, you have the patrons from both within India as well as abroad. But tell me a little bit about your hope for the future.
My future is very bright because I am very focused. I have never done commercial work and I am not into industry to earn money. I'm here to enjoy my life and I am enjoying each and every day my new embroidery. We make our pieces, we don't finish our pieces, but in the market, the trend is to finish in particular time frame and particular budget. In my case, it's not like that, but everybody is not lucky like me. After industrialization, we got so many different kinds of machine. And one of the reason is craft is dying because we started copying the craft with the machines. So RE embroidery has been, you know, since few decades now, has been practiced on a machine, and you cannot compare handwork with the machine work in terms of quality or price. And this is the main reason. Second, the consumer in India, they are mad behind designers. They are wearing label. They talk about which label they are wearing. They never talk about which craft they are wearing. They don't care for quality because they don't understand the quality. If they understand the quality, they will ask a designer why they are charging so much money for the machine embroidery. So for the general market, I don't have big hopes, but yes, I will continue what I am doing. I will go finer and finer, and I have documented hundreds and hundreds of samples, properly mounted, documented, and now I started doing with the natural fibers and innovation. So I will have now more archive. I have a big archive, but I will have, we talk about museums. We talk about the centuries, 18th century, 17th century. And then we really talk about 19th century as well, but we never talk about 20th century. So in 20th century, we have destroyed everything. So in 21st century, I have taken this challenge. We have already crossed 2 decades. So I have taken this challenge that I want to make a museum of 21st century textile, which in this next festival, when I'm celebrating 3 decades, so there I'm showing Gujarat, mainly Kutch, what we can create in 21st century. So this entire collection is based on Varso, is we have given name, which is a legacy. And I'm putting my first collection of 21st century textile, which we have created in pandemic, which was very depressing time. And artisans have enough time because they were not in pressure of supplying to the designer in particular time. So they are creating masterpieces, and they have created masterpieces all over India, which we are calling white on white. When we say white on white, is a natural fiber.
Wonderful.
So this is what we are putting. So just an education, just to showcase, just to show to the world that what India can produce in the 21st century if you give them time and little good budget.
Yeah. Thank you, Asif. That really is a signal of hope for the future. And I look forward to seeing that Verso, the white on white collection. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rosemary and Asif, for bringing so much knowledge to the session today. And I have to say, we continue to be inspired by a document such as you and Shilpa Shah has put together, the Shoemaker Stitch, which represents so much of this wonderful work over centuries with Mochi Embroidery. And with that, I'm going to conclude this part of the session and hand it over to Sneha, who will read out the questions, the Q&A. Sneha, over to you.
Thank you, Radhi. I'm going to get straight to the questions, and probably following in the spirit of what Asif was just speaking about, there is a question from Savita Suri who asks, what is it in your view, Asif? What are the top three or the three biggest challenges for Mochi embroidery over the next decade?
First of all, we have to understand the technique. So we have to understand how much time it will take. How Rosemary said that for the royals, the lengas, you have seen the difference between the general buyer and the royal buyer. So royal, it's not only they have spent so much money, but they have given enough time to produce that skirt. And in today's time, we just don't give time. So hopes are not too much hopes I have. Mochi community have stopped doing embroidery. I think very few artisan, and I don't know any artisan who are practicing. So I don't know about Mochi community, but yes, Ari embroidery is happening all over India. In every city, we have karkhanas, and they are doing, but they are also suffering because people have stopped giving them enough work and wages are too low. So nobody wants to work in a craft sector. They are getting more money as a daily, labor. If they do work in construction side, they will earn more. So that we have to understand that when we spend so much money on designer labels, we never go and ask any discount or anything, and we never check why they are charging so much. And we have seen after pandemic, they have put discount of 70% or 90%. So we should understand that how much we are paying for the branding and not for the craftsmanship. So only hopes will come if consumer will understand and start giving enough time and good budget to the artisan. So then there will be hope. Otherwise, if we are running only behind the labels, then we will lose our craft heritage in next 10 years.
Thank you, Asif. I have another question from Shilpa Gupta. This is for Rosemary. She says, you had mentioned with regard to the craft process that at first the designs are drawn, and then there is the dyeing of the yarn, and then comes the part where the mochis do the embroidery. Were there in the past and also at present separate communities of artisans practicing these steps?
Oh, yeah, good question. Yes, all of these things are done by different people. The dyers are usually completely separate people that dye for lots of different makers. The artists who do the drawings will probably be from, I imagine they were from the Mochi community, but they were not the embroiderers themselves, as far as I understand it. They may have been, because in the book we do have designs that were done by some of those people who were named award winners. So it may be that they did the designs and the embroidery. But I think normally you get a designer, someone dyeing the yarn or the cloth or whatever, and then the actual practitioner who does the actual embroidery or whatever it is. So yes, different people would do those different stages.
I can add in this. So the basic design who does is called Naqse Navis. And Naqse Navis draw this design on the paper. And then yarn makers are always different. Dyers are different. Artisan, they just buy nowadays from the market the ready yarn. And then, even while doing embroidery, a person who transfers this design from stencil to the fabric is a different. And then a person who does Ari, they sit and do the embroidery. But like in my studio, I sit with my artisan and I set my embroidery. So which color will come where, the number of stitches also we count, and the embellishment what we do. So yes, it's the Naqshe Navis is a very important part of embroidery community, because they only, if their drawing is proper, that will give you 40% of your quality work. So there are so many different people involved in one embroidery.
Okay, that's fascinating. As a follow-up, Yash Patil has a question about how were the designs drawn on paper transferred to fabric, especially in the earlier centuries?
One for Asif, perhaps? I think it was, were they pricked and then rubbed over?
Yes. That, and second is, they used to use this block also. In olden, in a later period, they have even made a block. First they draw on paper, then they used to make a block, and then they were using different kinds of natural pigments to transfer their design on the fabric, like how even today they practice in Lucknow. I have even seen those kind of block in different kinds of work, even in Chinese embroidery or in Indian embroidery. So that was that. And second, in later period in 19th century, they were drawing, they were Naqse Navis who were expert. So this old master artisan used to tell me, they used to stretch this fabric on the scroll frame, and Naqse Navis used to start drawing on the fabric. And other side, they used to ask them, okay, now set the design. And within no time, they used to draw on the fabric. So there were so many different ways they were doing.
Great. We have another question, which says, what is or has been the role of the state or other organizations and design institutes in contemporizing this craft form? And also, what is your take on bringing such traditional knowledge systems and practices in the education and training sector, especially design schools? Would anyone like to?
Not for me.
Okay, so it is very important to teach in Design Institute technical knowledge, because even in Design Institute we don't have craft classes. It is very important to invite artisan and teach them the entire process, because even in Fashion Design Institute the main embellishment is an embroidery and the weaving. So they have to at least spend when they do internship in the industry, instead of that, they have to even add internship with the artisan, one week or 10 days. It's depend on which course they are taking. So REs are those block printing and all that. They just give introduction, for one class, just craft class, introduction, over. So when student comes to us, they are blank. They have no idea how to do it. And and they come with the label of, we are coming from Design Institute. So that designer label, they come with some ego, so they are not ready to learn. So I think even after 3 decades I'm learning, I feel I don't know anything. So yes, it is very important to introduce courses, like as Rosemary said, that even conservation become a big subject nowadays. But how many of us know how to hold the needle, right? So that this is, everybody should learn this. Everybody should learn. And especially in Design Institute, they had to introduce this kind of courses, yes, specialized courses. Embroidery is a vast subject.
I would agree that in today's digital world, we've kind of not been teaching the hands-on skills in design institutes as much as we should. But on the other hand, I just wanted to say that on the positive side, NID from the very beginning, as you know, has emphasized craft documentations, and it's resulted in this wonderful book, which is encyclopedic in its nature, called Handmade in India, by Aditi and MP Ranjan. And it's been wonderful in the last 5 to 6 years to see the rise of craft documentations in other design institutes like NIFT and Pearl. I agree they could spend more time with the craft documentation and also getting their hands dirty, as I always call it. But, this is a very positive development, the interest in craft.
Yeah, but as you said that you have to dirty your hands, then only craft comes with the hand,
Yes.
not with the mind. So documentations are done enough, right? In the institutes are loaded with the documents. It's not accessible to the public. So it has no meaning. It's lying in the library. I don't know in what condition, like how, in museums, you can't touch the textile, you can't take the pictures and all that. There are ways you can use it. Let them accessible to the public, then only we can save our craft heritage. It is dying very fast. And yes, we have to be positive. I am ready to teach anyone and everyone, but nobody wants to learn. I cannot find a person because they want to learn in a overnight, which is not possible. So yes, my question here is that we have to introduce and we have to let them do themselves little bit. I'm not saying that they have to be expert, but at least when they will do it by themselves, they will learn the craft and they will understand that this is time consuming. That's why my embroidery is so beautiful. I have seen tears in people's eyes after seeing my embroidery. And I thought, what is this? Why you are crying? And but you with your work you can reach to people's soul. That is important. So yeah, it's a long debate. So I think it's endless. Yeah, Sneha, go ahead.
I guess a question to this point by Rosella Franco, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is what can we do as consumers or citizens to help preserve these crafts at the verge of extinction? Would you say it's at the verge of extinction? How would you
buy them? People have to buy them and use them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, use for your gifts. Like, if we are rich, we always give branded bags and branded shoes, which are available on the footpath. The fake branded products are available everywhere. But the craftsmanship, which is done by hand, is not available. Nobody can copy. People can copy my design. I will be very happy the day I will see the copy of my quality. So I will honor that person that, okay, you have copied my quality and that's what I want. So yes, people should consume every day. They have to make budget. If they are spending, say $5,000 for one bag, so at least they spend $500 for our craft. And we have so much variety to use for our craft. And that is where Radhi, we need people from NID or Design Institute who can design the product using the craft. And that is what CDS Art Foundation is talking about, collaboration. We never give credit to the artisan. So that is one of the reason craft is dying. This artisan wants to become a designer. And now when I started calling myself artisan embroidery wala, so embroidery wala, they like it and they said, oh, we want to become an artisan now. So that is very important because we have to give them respect. We give respect to the designer, but we never give respect to the artisan. So that is also one of the reason craft is dying. So give them respect. Don't bargain with them. Trust them. But when we go and buy this branded stuff, do we bargain for $5,000? But when we go and buy 500 rupees stuff and we bargain and we get so much satisfaction that we have saved 5 rupees, what nonsense is that? How can we save it? So use it, promote it, and enjoy it. Talk about your craft. Never talk about the label. Talk about which craftsmanship, which craft you are wearing for your wedding, not which label you are wearing. That's the reason craft is dying, because we are running behind the label. We are not running behind the craftsmanship and the craft. So that is important.
And move on to the next question. This is from Savita Suri for Rosemary. She asks, how much of their own culture did the Mochi community bring into their craft? In weaving, we see weavers traditionally inspired by their immediate environment. Do we see a similar pattern here as well?
Yeah, interesting question. And I think the answer is very little. The Mochis were making for a high-class elite customer. And I'm sure the Mochis themselves didn't wear those beautiful silk gagras or live in wonderful embroidered tents or whatever. So I think they were tailoring what they made to the tastes of those patrons, which was basically a sort of modified Mughal kind of floral design. So what the Mochis would have made for themselves, I don't know. Perhaps one can look back to their leatherwork of earlier times to find that out. But really, I think they were making totally separate things purely for their wealthy patrons.
Right. Interesting.
Rosemary, I wonder whether we could find a clue to some of these motifs in the floral borders with the parrots. You know,
that's possible. Yes.
And then
that's true. That's true. I mean, a lot of Gujarati domestic embroideries do use things like parrots, flower heads, and so on. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's possible that they would have.
The Panyadi.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. Yeah. So maybe they would originally have also made for themselves such things. Yeah, it's a very good point.
There's also another question for Rosemary. Are there any connections and or differences between Mochi embroidery and Bengal's Satgaon quilt chain stitch?
Not directly, I don't think. I think it's just a coincidence that two very separated regions both used chain stitch. I mean, I don't think there was I mean, I may be wrong because Gujaratis did travel a great deal all over India, bringing textile crafts with them. But as far as I know, the Satgaon quilts of the 17th century didn't derive from Gujarati chain stitch. As far as I know, it arose independently. But I'm willing to be contradicted.
So here, the Satgaon embroidery is not on scroll frame or hook. It is the chain stitch, which is done on. It's not continuous chain stitch. So
done with a needle, yeah.
In the needle, yeah. So when you do with the Ari embroidery, so when you lose your knot, the entire chain will come out. But in Satgaonkar, it will not come out. So there is no connection. It's totally different technique. Name are same, but that is chain. Like in Gujarati, we call it chain stitch sankri. So it's like a chain. Gujarati word is a sankri. But Ari Bharat, we call it Ari. So it's different.
Right. And in the spirit of preserving and supporting local artisans, we have two kind of linked questions. Nandita Ramanathan asks, how can new collectors acquire such textile art, especially at affordable prices? And can this happen online? And there's also another question which asks, what is the process of approaching traditional artisans, say for custom-made pieces, and where does one go to find these communities?
You can certainly find a lot of very beautiful antique embroideries on online auctions. I was just looking at one that took place somewhere in the US a couple of days ago. A woman had made a fantastic collection of mostly Gujarati embroideries, and they were going for like $200, that kind of thing. So, you know, for a beautiful antique textile, that's not a lot of money. So I would keep your eye on the internet. Even dealers on Instagram often have nice pieces. So there's a lot of things still around, and many dealers in India have really good stuff. So it is possible to make still a nice collection of antique embroideries and other textiles.
And
If
for
you're talking
new,
about older stuff.
and for new, you have to go to the mostly organization, because what happened that these artisans are now, very few artisans are trained as an artisan, because they are doing this as a skilled labor. So you will not like their color palettes. They are not good with the drawing. They know only the how to use the needle. So the organization, they know the technique, and in-house their studios, they have artisans. So it is better to go to them so they can make for you. And regarding affordable and non-affordable, it's depend how much you want to spend. So yeah, for some people $1,000 is affordable, and some people it's depend. You get everything in your price range. But yes, and yes, we have so many different kinds of exhibition in India. So yeah, lots of master artisans comes there, so you can meet them directly. And now everybody is on Instagram, so just go search it. Yeah, it's easy.
Yes, the miracles of technology. Thank you. That sort of brings us towards the end of this session. Thank you, Radhi, Rosemary, and Asif, for sharing all your insights and beautiful work with us today. I would just like to maybe spare another minute if anyone has any concluding thoughts, and then we can end the session.
Well, this wonderful book I've been pouring through it as I have been preparing for today, and it truly is a treasure. So thank you, Rosemary, and thank you, Shilpa, Shah, for putting this together, and to the Taki collection for bringing the collection together. And most importantly, thank you, Rosemary, for giving us that historical perspective that brought us to, where we are today, and Asif's work. And Asif, thank you so much for talking about something that, as you said, we touched upon during the pandemic, this idea of the luxury of time. And in today's world where there's so many distractions, your focus is really commendable. And the takeaway for me is to find more time to practice some of these wonderful skills, and for those who are listening to learn some of them and begin to value these beautiful pieces of art from just a taste of what it is to make them. So thank you, Sneha as well, and Bangalore International Center.
Thank you. And I'd just like to thank the audience for all their questions as well. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. And yeah, thank you. And with that, we come to an end. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.